Late on the evening of April 21, 1969, 24-year-old Secretary Sharon Wood left her workplace in Portland and went to a scheduled meeting with her husband, who wanted to discuss the details of their upcoming divorce. She went down to the basement of the parking lot where her car was parked. Here a tall, plump man approached her. She would later tell the police that she intuitively sensed someone behind her. She immediately got her bearings and was going to walk to the place where other people could hear her screams. Just thinking about it, that someone tapped her on the shoulder, and she turned around. The stranger was holding a gun. He advised her not to scream, but this sudden encounter both frightened and angered the young woman. She decided to fight. Sharon screamed and backed away from him. And the man grabbed her, wrapped his arms around her neck, and began to strangle her. He was much taller and weighed at least 50 kilograms more. She had almost no chance of winning this fight. But the woman believed that if she didn't fight until someone else heard the sounds of fighting, she would die the same day. Instinct told her that this man had murder on his mind. Sharon kicked him with her high-heeled shoes and screamed again. She grabbed his gun and turned it sharply. When the man tried to gag her with his hand, she bit into his palm with all her might. She knew she had bitten through his hand until it bled. He tried to free himself, but he couldn't. So now he had to fight her. He grabbed the girl by the hair and tried to knock her to the floor. But she continued to resist with all her might. She wasn't going to let him rape her. And yet, he managed to hit her head on the concrete, thereby stunning her. She unclenched her jaw and released his hand from her mouth. Then, Sharon heard the sounds of an approaching car. The attacker picked up his gun from the floor and hurried to escape. She didn't remember anything further. Obviously, someone called the police, and then Sharon gave a statement to the officers. She remembered that he was a tall man with blue eyes and freckles on his face. She would definitely recognize him if she saw him again. However, when the police questioned other residents of the area, no one could remember a similar man. It is only much later that Sharon learns that this man's unsuccessful attempt to rape her only changed his approach to subsequent attacks and forced him to act more cautiously. Sharon would manage to survive, but, unfortunately for many other girls, meetings with this man will have much more deplorable consequences. The next day, 15-year-old Gloria Jean Smith from Salem, Oregon, complained about a large freckled man who tried to push her into a green Volkswagen Pocket J sports car. Both incidents seemed to be connected, but did not give any real clues. There were no witnesses in either case, and the freckled man with blue eyes left no trace. Then the investigators did not realize that they were involved in the case of the capture of a brutal serial killer. Those years were a difficult time for the United States. There were riots all over the country. In 1968, America was shocked by the assassination of presidential candidate Robert Kennedy. The audacity of the Chicago 7 at the Democratic Party convention, and violence on college campuses due to protests against the Vietnam War. A huge group of citizens experimented with drugs and the occult. The country was to see many more serial killers. Albert DeSalva, known as the Boston Strangler, operated in Boston. In Tucson, Charles Schmidt, nicknamed the Pied Piper, was arrested for the murder of 3 girls from Michigan. A series of murders of 8 female students was committed, and California witnessed the massacre of the Manson family and the actions of the Zodiac. But nothing like this has ever happened in Oregon. It will take some time before investigators realize that they are looking for a serial killer. Even then, they could not fully understand what monstrous motives were driving them. On the day they interrogated Sharon Wood, this man had already killed 3 women. Linda Ann Lawson worked for a book company. She went from house to house and persuaded families to buy sets of encyclopedias. She was only 19 years old. It happened on January 26, 1968, and her route took the girl to the Portland, Oregon area. Some say she just got the wrong address. But in fact, no one knows what happened, except for the story subsequently told by the person she encountered. No one ever saw Linda Sloan again. The book company had no information about where she was that day. Therefore, desperate requests to the police from the family with Lawson did not lead to anything. They managed to find her abandoned car. But it didn't give any clues about what had become of her. No signs of a struggle were found in the car, and none of the personal belongings were missing. The girl just disappeared. They continued to search for her, but every day the chances of a successful solution of the case were less and less. In addition, the officers' time was taken up by other, more serious incidents. If she was abducted, then the kidnapper was very careful. He left no trace of his presence. Next year, Linda's case will be remembered more than once when other young women begin to disappear. On November 26, 1968, 23-year-old January Whitney disappeared on her way home to celebrate Thanksgiving. Her Rambler was found on a highway in a recreation area near Albany, Oregon. It was locked, but there was no sign of the girl nearby. Most likely, Jen's car broke down, and she decided to hitch a ride to ask for help. It happened at a time when the girls were freely hitchhiking along the West Coast. At the same time, maniacs of all stripes realized how easy and simple it was to lure and kill them. There were no leads in the case. Like Linda Sloan, Jenna Whitney just disappeared. 4 months later, on March 27, 1969, 19-year-old Karen Sprinker disappeared. She was driving home from college, and her mother was expecting to meet her daughter for lunch at a downtown restaurant. She waited for an hour and then became worried. There was no way Karen would have missed this meeting. Later it turned out that the girl had parked her car in the parking lot of the store, where her mother was waiting for her. The car was empty. Karen never came back to pick her up. Shoppers from the area said they saw a very tall and strange woman nearby. One witness reported that when this woman approached her, it turned out that it was a man in women's clothes. He seemed pretty creepy, so people avoided him. Then there was no reason to link him to this incident. But later it turns out that it is he who is involved in the mysterious disappearances of the girls. Just 4 weeks later, 22-year-old Linda Sally was apparently abducted from a shopping mall. She was choosing a gift for her boyfriend, but did not come to meet him that evening. She also didn't show up for work, and her car was later found abandoned. As in the case of the other missing persons, there were no signs of violence or presence of strangers in the car. Her boyfriend was checked for involvement in the disappearance, but was quickly excluded from the list of suspects. And again, the young girl disappeared without a trace. Police wondered if there were any connections between these missing girls. Many officers also recalled the encyclopedia saleswoman Linda Sloan. They outlined the terms of the investigation, noting the fact that all the girls disappeared closer to the second half of each month. And they were all young white women. But that's all the investigators had then. This continued until human remains were found in a nearby river. It's been 3 weeks since Linda Sally disappeared. A man who went fishing on the Longtome River in Oregon in May found decomposing human remains bobbing in the swift current. He called the police. The police officers who arrived at the scene found that the deceased woman was tied to the gearbox of the car in order to weigh down the body, which made it difficult to pull it to dry land. But it provided clear evidence of the murder and possible evidence that could be linked to a specific suspect, if law enforcement officers found him. It turned out that the victim was tied to the gearbox with a nylon rope, copper wire, and a rather specific knot, which was not widespread in those years. The police carefully cut the cord to preserve the knot in case they had a reason to use it as a probable cause for obtaining a warrant, or later as evidence in court. The copper wire was also twisted in a special way, which indicated that the suspect had experience as an electrician. The medical examiner understood that it would be difficult to determine the exact cause of death, since there was very little initial data. But judging by the marks on the neck, it was still possible to find out that the victim was strangled. There were also a couple of strange post-mortem punctures on the body, each of which was surrounded by a burn. Both were located on the chest, and, apparently, were performed with a needle. Thanks to dental records, it was determined that the remains belonged to the missing Linda Sally. Investigators continued their search along the river, and a few days later, came across another set of decomposing remains. They were also tied to car parts. Later it turned out that the engine. This victim was tied with the same rope and knots, which was quite clear evidence that the same person was involved in both crimes. This victim was strangled, most likely with a belt. The fragments of clothing still remaining on the victim's body matched the one described by Karen Sprinker's mother. However, when the police recovered the body from the water, they found that the victim was also wearing a long black bra, which turned out to be too big for her, which was confirmed by her mother, and was lined with brown paper towels. It turned out that the victim's chest had been removed, and a sanitary pad was placed in place of the terrible wounds, absorbing blood and fluid. Some believed that in this way the killer wanted to create the appearance of a large breast. But these assumptions were not confirmed then. Further searches along the river did not bring any more clues, although investigators continued to hope that these efforts would help close the case of the other two missing women. They knew they had to look for either a fairly strong man or two men working in tandem, because it would be quite difficult for an average person to carry the bodies together with the weights. Because of Karen Sprinker's past, the police decided to question the students of the University of Oregon in Carvalho. This will prove to be a wise move. Detectives who interviewed students found out that some female students had recently complained about strange calls from a man who tried to seduce them. There were also reports of a suspicious red-haired, somewhat chubby man who was often seen loitering around the campus. Detectives interviewed one young woman who ventured on a short date with this man, who called himself a lonely Vietnam veteran looking for company. That sounded promising. This girl was not going to meet a man again because she found him a little strange. She also remembered that he started a conversation with her about the bodies found in the river. The detectives asked her to inform the police if he called again. This man also asked her why she was not afraid to meet strangers like this. After all, they, for example, can strangle her. Detectives considered these questions abnormal curiosity. In addition, her description of a tall man with blonde hair and lots of freckles. It was similar to the description of the women who were almost abducted in recent days. Detectives fervently hoped that this man would contact this woman again. To her surprise, that's exactly what he did, and the girl made an appointment in an hour, and then called the police. The detectives approached the designated meeting place and noticed a tall, plump man. When they approached him, they found out that his name was Jerry Brudos. Although they considered him a suspect, he was completely at ease, as if he had nothing to hide. This meant that he was either really innocent or very smart, arrogant, and had no remorse for what he was doing. The police had no reason to detain this man, but they kept him under surveillance. having found out where he lives, as well as the rather entertaining fact that he works as an electrician. The detectives began to study his biography. Jerome Henry Brudos was born on January 31st, 1939th year in South Dakota. His parents traveled around the country for a while in search of the most favorable place to live and finally settled in Oregon. Most likely, the boy was not a desirable child for the mother since she already had a son. Therefore, she treated little Jerome with criticism and disdain. The woman wanted a girl, and if Jerry understood this, it could affect his development and self-perception. Opposite her eldest son, Larry, the woman simply adored. Jerry was an unremarkable and sickly child. He didn't have many friends. The boy often complained of sore throats and migraines. At school, he received average grades, unlike his academically successful and popular brother. In high school, Brudos remained an unremarkable person for both his peers and teachers. He rarely engaged in extracurricular activities, although it is known that in his early teens, he was secretary-treasurer of a youth club. Because of the lack of maternal affection and love, he became attached to other women who were not like his mother. As a child, he became very friendly with one girl, but she died, which also left an indelible mark on the guy's soul. Often being alone, he invented a life and habits that he did not have. Because of this, by the age of 17, Jerome began to have problems with the law. They were usually associated with the sexual fetish of women's shoes and underwear. Exactly how Brudos became a foot fetishist remains a mystery. However, one thing is for sure. He began to show this obsession at an astonishingly early age. The starting point was his discovery of a pair of women's stiletto heels with clasps with rhinestones at a local landfill. When he was 5 years old. Although it probably wasn't because of the shoes themselves. Most likely, it was all the fault of his mother's strong reaction, who saw that he was wearing these shoes in his bedroom. The mother became enraged and yelled at the boy, beat him up, and burned the shoes she found in front of Jerry. She was very excited and inexplicably upset, which made Jerome convinced that there was something attractively forbidden in these shoes. It is likely that this ban created an aura around women's high-heeled shoes, which permeated the developing sexuality of Brudos. He also stole the shoes of his kindergarten teacher, which she kept in her desk, for which he was reprimanded. Later, he recalled his fascination with women's shoes and women's feet, which arose as a result of an incident when, at the age of about 5, he watched the teenage daughter of a family friend sleeping on his bed. As he grew up, his shoe fetish became more and more sexually aroused. Psychologists who later analyzed his behavior were inclined to agree with this. Brudos continued to secretly collect shoes, hiding them from his mother, and eventually began to replenish his cache with a collection of women's underwear, which he stole during secret raids into nearby houses. Touching women's underwear gave him a certain sense of comfort and a sense of excitement. They were mysterious and forbidden totems that aroused deep erotic feelings in him, which he could neither understand nor explain. However, the guy was very shy to communicate with his peers. Moreover, his height and severe acne further reduced his confidence in his ability to please girls. By 1953 year, Brudos began to masturbate. Later, he claimed that as a teenager, he did not have ovulation during masturbation, although he often experienced poles. Whenever his mother found semen stains on the sheet, the guys were punished and forced to wash not by themselves. When in 1956 year, he turned 17 years old. Jerry's fetish started to taste dangerous. He dug a hole on the hillside to keep girls in it as sex slaves. In April of the same year, Brudos persuaded a 17-year-old girl to go on a date with him, taking her to a deserted road. He ordered her to undress so that Jerome could take pictures of her naked body. The girl refused, after which Brudos pulled her out of the car and began to beat her, as a result of which he broke her nose. The girl's screams attracted the attention of a young couple passing by, who stopped and intervened in the conflict. Brudos unconvincingly stated that the girl fell out of the car and immediately changed his story, saying that a hysterical girl was attacked by some kind of weirdo whom he defeated. His story was not believed, and the couple took the two of them to the nearest police station, where Jerome confessed that he had attacked the girl, but stated that his intention was simply to intimidate her into taking off her clothes, so that he could take her picture. Jerry denied that he had ever done anything of this kind before and insisted that his temper just got over him. Brudos was arrested on charges of assault and battery. A subsequent search of Brudos' bedroom revealed his extensive collection of women's clothing, as well as numerous Polaroid photographs of teenage girls. One of the girls was identified. She was contacted and told about Jerry's actions in August last year. Brudos was taken into custody and transferred to the Juvenile Affairs Department. For this crime, he served 9 months in the psychiatric ward of the Oregon State Hospital. During this imprisonment, he managed to attend school. While in this institution, Jerome Brudos underwent a number of checks during which it turned out that he was a depressed person, suffering from schizotypal personality disorder, but did not suffer from severe mental illness or delirium. During therapy, doctors learned that his sexual fantasies were centered around hating a demanding mother and taking revenge on women in general. They also knew about his collection of women's clothing. Jerry's fantasies included putting the abducted girls in a freezer so that he could later arrange their stiffened bodies in sexually explicit poses. The psychiatric report issued to him indicated that the examining psychiatric staff did not believe that Brudos was seriously mentally ill. He was diagnosed with borderline schizophrenia. In adolescence, he began a transition period, because of which he was not considered dangerous. Although Jerome has developed a fetish for women's shoes and underwear, as well as nude photos of women, he seemed immature and unable to cope with his developing sexuality normally. But this did not seem to anyone to be the basis of violence. The doctors believed that the guy would grow up and everything would pass, and they can hardly be blamed for this misconception. After all, in 1956 year, almost nothing was known about sexual maniacs. In March 1957 year, Brudos joined the army, where he was trained as a communications technician. Although he became a highly qualified specialist in this profession, his military service was generally unremarkable. In October of the same year, he was discharged ahead of schedule due to strange delusional states, according to other sources, because of sexual obsessions. It is known that he acquired a reputation among his fellow soldiers as a visionary, who repeatedly stated that he was in casual sexual relations with a beautiful Korean girl who sneaked into his bed every night. Brudos returned to his parents in Oregon, where he got a job as an electronics engineer at a local radio station. Colleagues considered Jerry an outstanding, experienced and conscientious employee who was distinguished by a meek demeanor, but had no ambitions for promotion, despite the fact that he was a licensed technical specialist in the field of broadcasting, which was gaining momentum in those years. For several years, while Brudos lived with his parents, his mother allowed him to sleep in the second bedroom. While his older brother was in college, however, when his brother graduated and returned, Jerry was forced to sleep in a shed at the back of the house. In 1961, when he was 22, he met a shy 17-year-old girl named Ralphina Schwindler. The young people were brought together by a teenager who, being an electronics lover, often visited the radio station where Jerry worked to ask him about his work. Once, as a joke, this teenager noted the shyness of Brudos in relation to female employees. He jokingly suggested that he find a girl, and Brudos, to his surprise, agreed. And the teenager took Jerry to the Schwindler house. On September 30, 1961, Brudos and Schwindler, who at that time was in the first month of pregnancy, got married. At first, the newlyweds lived in Portland, and in the summer of 1968, they moved to a small house in the suburb of Salema. In their marriage, 2 children were born, daughter Teresa and son Brian. To supplement the family income, Brudos repaired cars from time to time in the family garage. Brudos never subjected his wife to physical or emotional abuse. Although in the early years of their marriage, he insisted that she go around the house and do household chores, exclusively in the nude. At home, she was only allowed to wear high-heeled shoes. Before having sex, Brudos often photographed his wife in the nude. The wife was forbidden to enter her husband's workshop and the attic. For several years, Ralphina agreed with such inclinations of her husband, and it is known that Jerry Brudos did not commit any crimes. In the first years of their marriage. By the mid-1960s, the eldest daughter Teresa began to demand more physical attention and care from her mother. Therefore, Ralphina began to refuse to walk around the house naked and in high heels. In addition, Jerome began to gain weight. Ralphina later stated that although she never informed her husband about it, his appearance began to repel her. Although Ralphina remained faithful to Jerome, they had less and less sexual relations. His wife devoted more time to her daughter and social activities with her friends. Meanwhile, Brudos spent more and more time either at work or in his workshop, where he was engaged in various projects in the field of electronics. In May of 1967 year, when his wife was giving birth to her second child in the hospital, Jerome quietly followed a young woman in beautiful high-heeled shoes to her house. He waited until dark, then entered her apartment and began to strangle the girl until she lost consciousness. Brudos would later state that initially his intentions did not include rape. But the sight of a young attractive woman lying limp and under his power aroused him to such an extent that he raped her unconscious body, and then fled the scene of the crime, taking her high-heeled shoes. Ralphina did not notice how her husband left at night and invaded other people's homes to satisfy his underwear fetish, although she felt some oddities in his behavior. One day he approached her dressed in women's underwear. His wife was shocked, and Jerry was offended by her inability to understand his act. He was looking for a woman who would obey his will and accept all his fantasies. Ralphina disappointed him, and he returned to his secret world. Another time, Ralphina found a paperweight in the shape of a woman's breast in the house. This fact bothered her very much, but Brudos had his own explanation. Not knowing what else to do, she accepted him and forgot about the incident, just like she did when she caught him developing nude photos of women. The following year, Brudos was arrested by police on the grounds of the University of Oregon Women's Dormitory. He was charged with stealing women's clothing. And at the time of his arrest, he had high-heeled shoes on his feet, women's underwear on his body. Several mass and serial killers, such as Jerry Brudos, claimed that they were forced to dress up as girls when they were children. But unlike him, most of them did not become transvestites. And some became transvestites without any influence from their parents. Dr. Lynn Fraser, a therapist from San Francisco who worked with transgender clients, offered a detailed discussion of the phenomenon of transvestism as she saw it from the experience of her clients. Describing it at a conference in 1990, she highlighted the classification system of transsexualism in men, which will help interested parties to understand this unusual multifaceted world. Cross-gender identity with an early onset, in which there is no sexual arousal associated with dressing up as a person of the other sex. Effeminate homosexuality, manifested in those who are talkative and uninhibited in sex. Late transvestism. Dressing up is associated with sexuality and is caused by specific things. As the female orientation gradually begins to dominate the male. Dressing up without transsexuality, dressing up as an escape mechanism, and without the desire to change gender identity. Jerome Brudos was one of the latter. Dr. Fraser does not touch on the erotic nature of fantasy, but it is obvious that underwear and shoes excited Brudos. As he became bolder in acquiring and wearing these items, he took advantage of his ability to sneak into women's bedrooms unnoticed. So one day, he attacked a sleeping woman and raped her. She reported it to the police, but no one took up the case, believing that the woman was to blame, and provoked the man intentionally. It is noteworthy that when Jerome was arrested, the police found out that Brudos had previously been involved in committing physical and sexual violence against women. But they released him anyway. In addition, it turned out that he had provided an invalid address of residence. A search of records in the vehicle database showed that Jerry lived in the same area of Portland where Linda and Laws were last seen. After finding out Brudos' real address, investigators discovered that at the moment he lived just a few blocks from the department store where Karen Springer was abducted. Moreover, although Brudos did not drive a Volkswagen Carmenja, investigators found that such a car belonged to his mother, and that he was driving it on April 22nd, on the day of the attempted abduction of Gloria Smith. Smith herself accurately identified Brudos as the person who tried to kidnap her. This information was considered a sufficiently probable reason for obtaining a search warrant for the property of Brudos. Police also obtained a search warrant for Brudos' car, but found that the interior had been thoroughly cleaned. Although it looked suspicious, it was still not prohibited by law. And Brudos had a ready-made explanation for this. But still, he had nothing to object to the words of the girl who chose him in the photo spread, as a man who recently tried to force her into the car. The choice of this girl became a sufficient reason for his arrest, as well as charges of possession of weapons in his own car. Detectives were hoping for stronger arguments, but there were some concerns that Brudos might panic and lock himself in. 5 days later, on May 18, 1969, when there were too many coincidences with the wanted criminal, Brudos was arrested again. By May 29, 1969, investigators had collected enough evidence of the attempted abduction of Gloria Smith to arrest Brudos for this crime. While the investigation of the murders continued, Jerome was discovered by traffic police officers hiding under a blanket in the back of his station wagon, while his wife Ralphina drove the car towards Portland. The very next evening, Brudos called his wife and asked her to destroy some incriminating evidence. But the wife rejected this request. After the second arrest, Brudos was thoroughly interrogated about the events related to the finds in his garage, as well as about his connection with the missing and murdered young women, 3 of whom investigators accurately identified as Whitney, Sprinkler, and Sally. At first, he denied his involvement in any of these cases, rejecting the evidence as circumstantial, and then, after a few days, gradually began to talk about his erotic fetishes and emphasized how deeply they were rooted in his psyche, and subsequently seriously affected his daily life. After Brudos was arrested, it was discovered that he was wearing women's panties intermittently. Despite the lawyer's warning to keep his mouth shut, Brudos began to speak. He said that when he was 28 years old, he met Linda Slow. She was his first victim. And only after he told the police about what he had done, his sick fantasies were fully revealed. In 1960, Alfred Hitchcock released Psycho. This is a black-and-white film based on the story of Ed Gein, showing a crazy nerd whose personality is dominated by his mother. The young man looks personable, but at the same time harbors a desire to inflict a fatal stab to a woman who sexually aroused him. In fact, he was killing an unacceptable part of himself. His condition of multiple personality disorder shocked the nation, especially with its creepy intersex manifestation. In the case of Jerry Brudos, the police were going to see something similar, only with the absence of mental illness. By the beginning of June 1969, Brudos had provided investigators with a full confession to all 4 murders, which he subsequently described to the police and even later to a psychologist. He began by describing the opportunistic murder of Linda Slow, whose name he could not remember, which was not related to him, and which, according to him, was provoked mainly because of the attractive high-heeled shoes that the young woman was wearing when she knocked on his door to sell encyclopedias. The girl who naively followed him to the workshop to show her encyclopedias. He struck hard enough to knock her out right away. Then he strangled her. His wife and children were in the house at the time. And even though there was a dead girl lying on the floor of the workshop, he entered the living room, had quiet conversations with his family, invited them all to go out and have lunch together. From January 1968 to April 1969, Jerry Brudos killed 4 women. Some newspaper reports indicate that there were 5 victims, but the 5th incident did not correspond to Brudos' modus operandi. And during interrogation, he denied that he knew this victim. Jerry also tried to kill several other people. Most of what is known about his meetings with these victims is derived from his own confessions, which he voluntarily gave for 3 days. The detectives who interrogated him noted his complete lack of guilt and remorse, although he mourned his fate, and sympathized with his wife and children. And also the fact that he never lost his appetite and enjoyed eating prison food, despite how grotesque his descriptions of bullying were. Brudos confessed that he killed and mutilated 4 women, threw their bodies into the river, after cutting off a piece from them. His first victim, Linda Sloan, did not have a left foot, and after he got rid of the rest of his body, he kept this foot for a while, trying on shoes on it and photographing it. He removed the breasts of the other 2. He also photographed them while the girls were at his mercy and had sex with their bodies. All of Brudos' victims were abducted and murdered for one purpose: to satisfy his need to dominate and possess attractive young women, as well as to satisfy his sexual fetishes. After the act of murder, each victim was subjected to a ritual of dressing up in various underwear and shoes, during which Brudos positioned the body in provocative poses and then photographed them and masturbated, often starting with caressing the victim's feet and ankles. Each victim was also subjected to acts of necrophilia, and 3 of them were mutilated after death. At the same time, Brudos kept the severed body parts to fuel his fetishes, as well as express his dominance. Subsequently, he threw all the body parts into the Willamette River. However, he kept the shoes and underwear of the victims to the last and stored them in the garage, where he strictly forbade his wife and children to enter without prior notice on the intercom installed specifically for this case. After the arrest, details of the murder of each victim emerged. The first murder of Brudos contradicted the conventional wisdom that murderers often dispose of the body, or leave the scene of the crime as quickly as possible. Later, when they get used to the corpses, they begin to perform more actions with them. But Brudos was obviously quite happy with his first experience. Immediately, having a dead girl in his arms, he began to think about what he could do with her, now that he had the real thing in his hands, and not just his obsessive fantasies. His personal images have acquired a sufficient degree of complexity to prepare him to spend some time with the victim, and realize everything that he had only dreamed of before. With encyclopedia saleswoman Linda Catherine Slow, Jeremy Brudos came across when he was working in his workshop on January 26, 1968. She mistakenly went to his yard, confusing his address with the address. The girl believed that she had an appointment with the landlord about buying an encyclopedia after hearing the reason for the visit. Brudos pretended to be interested in buying a set of encyclopedias to lure the girl to the basement of his house. He sent his wife and children to eat, and then, when a friend unexpectedly came, Brudos had to spend some time to get him out. When the girl sat on a stool and started advertising encyclopedias, Brudos hit her on the head with a piece of wood. Then he strangled her with his hands, after which he hid the body under the basement stairs. Then he ordered his wife to take the children away from home, ostensibly to buy hamburgers, after which he began to engage in necrophilia with Linda's body. He remembered every detail of the circumstances of the murder of this girl and all subsequent actions. After undressing the body of a young woman, Brudos discovered that Sloane was wearing rather racy red underwear. This situation prompted him to get a box of previously selected women's underwear and shoes, and began to dress the body in different outfits, each time raping the corpse and photographing most of the process. A few hours later, Brudos sawed off the girl's left leg with a hacksaw. The maniac put his foot in the freezer located in the basement. He planned to use this leg as a mannequin, both for an extensive collection of high-heeled shoes and to fuel their fantasies during acts of masturbation. He had so many stilettos that he could spend hours checking them for a severed leg and taking pictures. He also kept as a keepsake two encyclopedias that Linda and Lawson hoped to sell him. Brudos later tied S. Lawson's body to a heavy cylinder head and dumped it in Marion County. He could not remember the exact location of the body. As Brudos told his story, detectives were alarmed by the way he became increasingly arrogant as he described his horrific actions. It was as if he viewed the women he had killed and mutilated only as objects that belonged to him, and existed solely for his pleasure. Whatever life they led, whatever they did, it didn't matter to him. For him, only his own pleasure mattered. And since he needed this intoxicating sensation very much, very soon he had to look for a new victim. 23-year-old January Susan Whitney Brudos met when he was returning home from work on November 26, 1968. Later, Brudos insisted that this murder, like the murder by Sloane, was committed out of necessity. He didn't want to kill, but he had to when he noticed 3 people, a girl and 2 men, standing next to a broken rambler near Interstate 5 between Salem and Albany. After inspecting Whitney's car, Brudos said he could fix it, but he will have to go to his home to get the necessary tools. At the same time, the girl allegedly had to go with him. Whitney and her fellow hippies, whom she had picked up earlier, agreed to go with Brudos if only he promised that first of all he would take them, the men, to their destination. The 2 hitchhikers got into the back seat of Jerem's car, and Whitney sat on the driver's side. After dropping off the hitchhikers at their destination, Brudos drove Whitney to his house. Then he went home, leaving the car in the driveway, ostensibly to pick up the necessary tools to repair Whitney's car. Returning, Brudos climbed into the back seat of the car, asked the girl to close her eyes, and made a riddle of how to tie a shoelace without opening her eyes and without moving her hands. Whitney pondered the decision, after which Brudos attacked her and tightened a leather belt around her neck, and subsequently raped her lifeless body inside the car. After that, Brudos took the girl's body to his workshop, where he began to put different shoes and underwear on it, committing acts of necrophilia with every change of clothes and continuing to photograph the whole process on your Polaroid. Whitney's body hung from the ceiling in the workshop for 2 days, and Brudos confessed that he raped him whenever he felt the need. Jerry Brudos cut off one breast from the body to use it as a paperweight, but he later abandoned this idea when he noticed that the epoxy resin hardener had not completely hardened. Instead, Brudos stuffed his chest with sawdust and then attached it to a wooden board. According to Brudos, 2 days after Whitney's murder, a car crashed into his garage, punching a hole in the wall. After removing the body, which by this time should have already smelled of decomposition, he invited the police to come to inspect the damage from the accident. Apparently, they didn't feel anything, although the corpse was wrapped in plastic wrap in another building in the courtyard. The same evening, Brudos decided to get rid of the girl's body, so as not to test fate once again. He tied her corpse to a piece of rail and threw it into the Willamette River along with Linda and Lawson's sawn-off leg, which by this time had already decomposed. He declined to give a specific location of the body. Oddly enough, He told the police so much, but withheld key details, as if he thought that keeping some things secret would prevent them from bringing him to justice. Although this made it impossible for the police to find the body, they had enough evidence to bring Jerry to justice. Karen Elena Sprinker was an 18-year-old chemistry student at the University of Oregon on March 27, 1960. Brudos kidnapped her at gunpoint from the parking lot near the Myrna department store when she was on her way to her mother. Brudos, dressed in women's clothes at the time of the abduction, decisively drove his van into the parking lot. Saw a young woman in high-heeled shoes and a miniskirt. He parked the car and tried to chase the girl on foot, but soon lost sight of her. On the way back to his car, he noticed Karen getting out of the car and walking towards the department store. At gunpoint, he forced her into his car and drove her to his home. At the same time, Brudos did not beat or bully the girl. Sprinker repeatedly begged him not to hurt her. And when she found herself in his workshop, she declared that she would do whatever he wanted, as long as the kidnapper didn't kill her. In response, Brudos asked if she was a virgin. Sprinker answered in the affirmative, adding that she had started her period. Then Brudos forced her to undress and began raping Karen right on the floor of the workshop. After all this, he forced Sprinker to pose in different high-heeled shoes and underwear, while Brudos himself photographed her. Then Jerry Brudos tied the girl's hands behind her back and then threw a rope around her neck. After that, he asked if the rope was too tight. Karen replied that it was too much. Then he threw the rope over the ceiling beam of the workshop and began to pull it. The girl's legs left the floor, she began to convulse, and a little later, she died. Over the next hours, Brudos repeatedly committed acts of necrophilia with Sprinker's body. He also cut off both of her breasts to make plastic casts of her organs. He put a bra on the corpse, which was obviously too big, and stuffed it with rags instead of breasts. That evening, he tied a Karen Sprinker to a 6-cylinder engine and threw it into the Willamette River. In April 1969 year, Brudos, tormented by his fantasies, tried to kidnap 2 girls for several days in a row. 24-year-old Sharon Wood and 15-year-old Gloria Jean Smith. They both managed to escape from the maniac, and both reported the attacks to the police. Thanks to this, the police received a description of the attacker's appearance and compared his actions with previous abductions. Jerome Brudos' latest victim was 22-year-old Linda Dawn Sally. Sally was a student at Portland State University and worked part-time as a secretary at a local firm. Brudos kidnapped her on the territory of the Lloyd Center shopping center late on the evening of April 23, 1969 year. Here, the girl bought a pair of trousers and a watch strap as a birthday gift to her fiancé. And she was returning to her car when Brudos approached her, who tricked her into believing that he was a policeman by showing a fake police badge and telling the girl that she was arrested for shoplifting. Although Sally suspected something was wrong and declared her innocence, she agreed to go with Brudos to his car. There he grabbed the girl and said that he was kidnapping her for ransom. Then Brudos drove to his house. He parked in the garage and ordered Sally to follow him across the yard to the house, believing that his wife and children are visiting relatives. At that moment, his wife appeared on the porch and announced that she had prepared a family dinner. In response, Brudos, who was about 10 meters away from the porch, signaled Sally to stand still. He informed his wife Alfina that he would be at the house in a few minutes. I took Sally to the garage and tied her up with a rope. Then Jerry went home to have dinner with his family. After dinner, Brudos discovered that Sally had freed herself from her bonds, but made no further attempts to escape. She tried to resist his immediate attempts to throw a leather belt around her neck and knock her down. The girl kept asking the question, "Why are you doing this to me?" Then Sally started scratching and kicking Brudos, and he threw her to the floor again and again, lifting her by the leather belt. After a while, the girl lost consciousness. After that, Brudos finally strangled Sally and raped her lifeless body. Then he hung Sally's body by the neck from the ceiling of the workshop, as in the previous two cases. He inserted hypodermic needles into her chest under each armpit. I connected an electric current to the needles, trying to revive the girl's body. Jerry thought that under the influence of the current, the body would at least begin to twitch and squirm, but nothing like that happened. Only the places where the needles entered the girl's body turned black. He held Sally's body in this position for 24 hours, periodically raping him. Then he tied the corpse to the gearbox and threw it into the Willamette River. Although Brudos created an impression of Sally's breast, he did not mutilate this part of the girl's body, as was the case with previous victims, because he believed that the halos of Sally's nipples were too pink. When Brudos confessed to his crimes and provided details, it was obvious that it gives him great pleasure to describe his fetish for shoes, panties, and bras. He became even more excited when he described all these things, as if his passion could become contagious and infect the officers sitting with him in the interrogation room. Although Brudos admitted ultimate responsibility for his crimes, he continued to resist when asked about aspects of planning and premeditation, simply stating at one point, "There must be something wrong with me." He denied his hatred of women, but admitted that the murders allowed him to let off steam. Theaters that examined Brudos concluded that he could not get satisfaction from normal sexual intercourse, and that the main motive for his crimes was lust. Adding that even in cases where Brudos killed women he encountered in moments of opportunism, he knew that he would eventually kill his victim. On June 2, 1969, as reported in the local newspapers, Brudos was charged with first-degree murder in the death of Karen Sprinker, and the police prepared a search warrant. Brudos believed that he had removed the evidence from his workshop by ordering his wife to burn the stocks of women's clothing. But he didn't grin about it for long. Ralphina refused to comply with his order. A forensic team entered Brudos' home and workshop to find items that could link him to one or more victims, as well as learn more about his modus operandi. What they found there shocked them. Investigators photographed everything, including a hook and a block on the ceiling used to lift the bodies. They found a nylon cord and a leather belt that could have been used in the murder. From the shelf, they took down a form made of a terrible paperweight, which, according to Brudos, depicted a woman's breasts. Criminologists also found a cache of women's shoes of various sizes and many items of underwear, bras, belts, panties, and blindfolds, as well as a collection of Polaroid photographs. Some of them depicted Brudos himself in women's underwear, but the most important of them depicted his victims. They found a woman hanging from a hook, with a black hood on her head. The other body was dressed in several different items of clothing and photographed in various poses. Quite often, Brudos cut out heads with a photo to enjoy an anonymous female appearance. The photo that really caught the attention of criminologists completed the case against this monstrous killer, even in the minds of his own lawyers. The girl's body, dressed in a black lace combination and panties with garters, hung from the ceiling. The camera pointed at her crotch was reflected in the mirror on the floor. In the lower corner of the photo was a frozen image of the killer reflected in the mirror. It was Brudos looking at the woman he had just killed. Now the police had solid physical evidence against him. They also confirmed from the survivor the details of the rape, which Brudos confessed to, although this woman could not identify the attacker. In that incident, she lost several pairs of shoes and underwear. Police also found a coil of copper wire exactly the same type that was used to tie the bodies of Linda Sally and Karen Prinker to engine parts before they were thrown into the Willamette River. The piece of rope confiscated by the researchers was tied up in the same way as the victims' bodies were tied up. In addition, there were numerous engine parts in the garage. These findings were deemed sufficient to put Brudos under constant supervision. On the 4th of June, 1969, Jerome Brudos was charged with additional charges. Soon after, charges were also filed in the Whitney and Sally cases. Brudos was defended by attorney Dale Drake, who then teamed up with another talented criminal defense attorney, George Rotten. Both argued that the trial would be quite long and complicated, since the prosecution had an extensive list of witnesses and a solid evidence base. The lawyers knew that they would not be able to circumvent the real guilt of Brudos, so they formed a strategy based on mental illness. Jerry Brudos pleaded not guilty and, to the surprise of the lawyers, refused to plead guilty by reason of insanity, because he considered himself a genius. This meant that he had to undergo a mental health check arranged by both the country of defense and the country of prosecution. Sobbing, Jerome tried to convince the psychiatrists that he himself was the victim of a terrible mother. But most of them saw that he was just feeling sorry for himself. He added that in 1967 he had an accident. During the repair, he touched a live wire and lost consciousness from an electric shock. He survived, but subsequently began to suffer from severe headaches. It was after this that he allegedly began attacking women to steal their clothes and even committed rape in one woman's house. In this situation, he said that he could not control himself. He said that then he began to fantasize about storing the corpses of women in his freezer. He wanted to be able to have them dress and pose for him as and when he wished. In other words, he wanted a life-size doll. After his first murder, he bought a large freezer. Jerome had fired up his fantasy and wanted to be more prepared in case he got the chance again. Brudos was clearly a man who liked to keep the situation under complete control. In fact, he insisted that if he was treated in the hospital, he would get better. And he was determined to get out of the clinic and continue to raise his children. Brudos was unaware of the seriousness of his situation, but was not confused or disoriented. He was arrogant and showed no sense of remorse. 7 psychiatrists who examined him indicated that although he had a personality disorder, he nevertheless realized what he was doing, and that it was wrong. That is, legally he will not be considered crazy. Only an antisocial personality. However, Brudos was not a psychotic. He definitely knew what he was doing with these girls, and that it was illegal and wrong. Was he dangerous? Definitely. Was it possible to restore his condition? No. After consulting with his lawyers, who saw no other way out, on June 27, 1969, Brudos changed his plea of guilty to the murders of January Whitney, Karen Sprinker, and Linda Sully. He was sentenced to 3 consecutive terms of life imprisonment with the possibility of parole. He also confessed to the 4th murder, but the body of Linda and Lawson was never found, and he was not prosecuted in this case. Then Brudos' wife, Ralphina, was arrested and tried as his accomplice. One neighbor claimed to have seen Ralphina helping Brudos with the victim, but her testimony was later refuted. Since there was no evidence that Ralphina knew about any of her husband's crimes or participated in it, it was very difficult to believe that she was acquitted. However, in October of 1969, all charges were dropped against her. In 1970, she dissolved her marriage with Brudos, replaced them, and moved with her children to another place, which is still not reported. In August 1970, the Oregon Court of Appeals issued an opinion on Brudos' motion for a retrial. Brudos insisted that the court should not have accepted his guilty plea to 3 first-degree murders and therefore should not have imposed consecutive life sentences. Jerome Brudos' lawyer argued that if a person received a life sentence for a crime, all subsequent life sentences should be served simultaneously with the first sentence. The court replied that it could not consider the defendant's first statement of error during a direct appeal, and instead, the defendant had to provide grounds for revoking his plea within the framework of the relevant legislative framework. Thus, Brudos' appeal was completely rejected. As well as all subsequent appeals, including the one in which he claimed that he suffered from hypoglycemia when he gave a guilty plea. Brudos continued to periodically apply for parole, which each time caused a flurry of letters from residents of Oregon to the parole board to prevent the offender from being released. Brudos insisted that he no longer posed a threat to society, and even assured that he had not committed the murders. He also tried to mitigate his crimes by accusing his mother of abuse and neglect. In his appeals to the council, Brudos mentioned that during his criminal activities he had mental disorders and indicated that at that time the world seemed less real to him. In 1995, the parole board voted to keep him in prison for life. Nevertheless, Brudos continued to file a petition every 2 years, hoping that one day he would be released. However, he never showed any remorse. In the years since his incarceration, Jerome Brudos has become a model prisoner. He was allowed to walk around the prison without supervision, having received clerical duties in the 1970s. He later used his electronics skills to maintain a prison computer database system and install a cable television network. He was also tasked with completing, repairing, and servicing prison vending machines. He was even allowed to make leather key rings with engraved names and sell them through the prison store. Jerry Brudos was also allowed to order catalogs by mail with images of women showing high-heeled shoes and underwear. He used this material to fuel his erotic and masturbatory fantasies. While convicted of a sexual offense, Jerry Brudos suffered several physical assaults by fellow inmates, although in each case he refused to name the attackers. While in prison, Brudos gave several interviews to numerous people of different professions. One of these people was former Marion County Detective Jim Burns, who later recalled a conversation between him and Brudos about compassion and remorse, in which he asked the question, "Do you feel any remorse, Jerry? Do you feel sorry for your victims?" In response, Brudos took a piece of paper from the table, crumpled it up, then threw it on the floor, and replied, "Here is my compassion." Psychiatrist Michael Stone described Brudos as a psychopathic personality, noting his callousness and lack of remorse for his crimes. Brudos died of liver cancer while incarcerated in an Oregon state prison at 5:10 in the morning of March 28, 2006 year. At the time of his death, he was 67 years old and was the longest-serving inmate in the Oregon Department of Corrections, having served a total of almost 37 years.